This tutorial is sponsored by the 3D Coloring Book, a project specifically designed to help empower artists who are struggling with texturing in Substance Painter and to help show you that anyone can create beautiful pieces of art with just a little bit of practice and guidance. To instantly gain access to hundreds of pre-made professional level models and hours of high quality tutorials, click the link in the description and begin your journey today.
Hey guys, my name is Angus and this is my breakdown for Stylized. In this video, I'm going to run through the stages I went through while creating my Gilnean Postbox, starting from referencing and concepting, moving on to modelling, followed by unwrapping and texturing, and then finally my process for producing my final renders. A quick overview of the software I used for this project. I used PureRef for my reference boards, Photoshop for my initial concepts, hand painting my textures, and compositing my final renders, 3ds Max for creating the actual 3D model, 3D Coat for unwrapping as well as some minor texturing, and then lastly Sketchfab for my final renders. Lastly, just before we jump in, this project was created for my final week of the CGMA course Creating Stylized Game Assets with Ashleigh. Ashleigh is an artist at Blizzard Entertainment who's been working on World of Warcraft for many years now as a prop artist. Throughout the course, Ashleigh provides a lot of really good insight and advice towards hand-painted texturing and 3D art in general. You really get a lot of invaluable feedback from not only Ashleigh, but the entire class that just helps push the quality of your work forward. So a big thank you to them and Ashleigh. So when I first start any project, I like to begin by gathering references. A quick intro to the software I'm using here. It's called PureRef. It's free and it's used for building reference boards. You just click and drag any images you find online into it and you can easily start to build a reference board. You can also add notes like you see here using Control N. I like to use this to organize my references and also note artist names so I can easily explore more of their work in case I want to find out a bit more about them. I knew before I started the project that I wanted to create some sort of prop for a culture within World of Warcraft. What sort of actual prop I wanted to create though was a bit of a mystery. So I started by exploring the various cultures throughout World of Warcraft, and one area that really stood out to me was Gilnean, which is the home of the sort of werewolf style race, the Worgen. I really loved that Victorian London-esque buildings and sort of gothic look that it has. It also stood out as an area that had plenty of room for further development, with there being plenty of props that I felt I could really be explored further. Gilnean has the Old English vibe to it, and something that popped into my head while exploring it was the red pillar style postboxes of the UK. I thought they seemed like a sort of iconic British object, and since Gilnean seems to draw inspiration from the UK, I figured it would be cool to see Gilnean's take on that iconic design. So here in PureRef, you can see some of the screenshots I gathered that I felt really captured the Gilnean style. I also gathered some original concept art of Gilnean, as well as some artworks from Artstation that I really liked the look of. Looking at the concept art and screenshots, I tried to break down the key elements and motifs that made up the Gilnean style. I also used online resources such as the WoW Wiki to explore the lore and notes on Gilnean. So from my exploration of screenshots and concept art, the key elements that I noted were the high slanted tiled roofs, the onion dome sort of shapes that often sat atop the more narrow designs, the frequent use of candle lanterns, and a colour scheme of deep blues, deep browns, greys, and bright complementary oranges, which is often used in the windows and lights of much of Gilnean's environments. Also, from exploring the lore and wiki materials, I noted that roses were often used quite a lot, and as seen here in this Gilnean crest, and they're almost like a sort of emblem of Gilnean. I think this method of exploring games, cultures and art that you love and really analysing the themes used throughout and then breaking down the assets into common motifs and designs is a great way to improve your concepting skills. Coming up with an idea without using reference is really quite challenging. Lastly, I believe that exploring beyond what already exists in a game and developing new concepts but in that game's style is a great way to show your ability to follow a company's style, and shows that you really understand how to use their design prompts and motifs to create interesting concepts. So now that I had a good understanding of what a Gilnean prop looks like, I moved on over to Photoshop to sketch up some rough concepts. You may also notice that shape-wise, these are a little taller and narrower than my final model. I'll cover why that is in a second. So looking at these sketches, you can see that you don't need to be a drawing wizard to come up with a good concept. For techniques used, there's nothing really I have to highlight, it's just simple sketches. Ultimately, the most important part here is getting that clear concept across. So quickly running through them, you can see where I've incorporated those various design elements such as roses, onion domes, tiled roofs and candle lanterns. Once I had a variety of designs, I labelled them, as you can see here, and shared them with friends and community groups to find out what designs people like the best. From this, it seemed that there was a consensus towards designs A, B and E. So I combined the various elements from these designs into one more fleshed out design. Sharing your art is super valuable, and I can't stress enough how much it helps improve your work. Sometimes you can get tunnel vision on a design and become so overly attached to it that you don't realise its flaws. If you share your art, then people can point out the pros and cons of your design. In fact, that's exactly what happened here. I became focused on that UK pillar style postbox shape that we discussed earlier, that I didn't realise that it wasn't quite in line with the typical World of Warcraft postbox designs. Postboxes in WoW all have more top heavy designs and are a bit more short and wider. Luckily, I shared the design early on, and Ashleigh pointed this out to me and helped to produce a design that was more in line with WoW. So with my concept complete, I was ready to move on to modelling. I like to start out by just blocking out the major shapes first and obtaining a nice silhouette. So in this case, the most important parts were the base, the central box and the roof. For the base and central box, I just used standard box modelling methods. I also saved a lot of time by using two symmetry modifiers on the X and Y axes. In 3ds Max, you can click the Show End Result button here to preview your changes and all your mirrored objects. For the roof, I started with a plane, cutting edges into it and aligning the edges and verts to my concept in the background. I made heavy use of symmetry here also, as you can see, modelling just one side of a single roof and repeating it around. Symmetry is a really good time saver. And you can see here what the finished roof looked like. I ended up making it a bit taller later down the line, as I felt it was a bit too squashed for the Gilnean style. For these thorn railings, the rose stems and these little ropes, I used 3ds Max's spline tools. These curling ends were made using the helix spline. I just draw out a rough size that I want and then mess with the sliders until I get a shape that I like. To add thickness, it's under rendering. Just tick enable in viewport, then adjust the thickness. I'll also reduce the amount of sides, as it's a fairly small detail that shouldn't need too many polys. I use a similar process for the rose stems and rope, but instead of a helix, I just used a line tool instead. Once I have something I like, I just convert it to an edible poly. From here, I cut out some edge loops to reduce poly count, and extrude out the longer railing and extrude out some thorns. For my plants and elements such as the smoke, moths and letters, I actually textured them first. I started by painting them out in Photoshop and making the background in alpha. A quick and easy way to alpha off everything you need is by making sure you paint all the objects you want to alpha on one layer. You then duplicate that layer and apply a white colour overlay. Underneath that layer, I place my black background. With those two layers visible, I press Ctrl A to select my entire canvas, then Ctrl Shift C to copy from multiple layers. From there, head on over to channels, add a new layer to your alpha channel, and finally Ctrl V to paste your alpha layer. I can now delete those color overlay and black background layers. Also, to avoid any sort of bleeding on your transparent objects, be sure to paint a similar color on the layer below. This way any bleeding will blend with your texture. Lastly, just make sure to save your texture as an image file that includes an alpha channel. In this case, I used Targa. With my alpha material done, I import it into 3ds Max and assign it to a plane. Using the cut tool, I cut out a rough shape around each of my objects. Delete the area of the planes that I don't need. Now I continue to make cuts and arrange my verts to suit my object's shape. For these leaves, I place cuts that assist me in making a more natural leaf shape. I make sure to tick preserve UVs. This will prevent my texture from warping while I move the verts about. Once I'm happy with the shape, I pull the verts about to create bends in the leaf. Once I'm done, I select all the faces on my leaves and attach it as an object. I can now use this to create my plants. I repeat this process for all my alpha objects. And here are my roses, smoke, letters and moths after following this process. So now that I have my model complete, I export it over to 3D Coat. I like to make each UV set one size above the final resolution. So in this case, I'll make the postbox 2048 and export it out later as 1024. This makes the painting process easier, allowing me to paint more detail accurately, then export it out at a more appropriate resolution later. The first thing I usually do once I'm in 3D Coat is clear all seams and unwrap. Your UVs will look horrifying. Don't worry, it's just to reduce the amount of clusters while unwrapping and makes it easier to see what you're working on. After unwrapping all my object, this is what I ended up with. I use a lot of overlaying faces so that I don't have to texture them all uniquely, and also just to save UV space. Since the prop is made to be viewed from the front, I decided to make cuts up mostly the side and stack the front and rear faces. If I had made front, rear and side cuts, the repeated texture might have been too obvious. To overlay one identical unwrap atop another, just select the face you wish to overlay, hit Ctrl C, then select the face you wish to lay on top of and hit Ctrl V. Remember, to stack UVs, they must have identical topology and UV seams. To help align the texture of all the roof tiles and save myself a lot of time, I stacked every single side of the roof to share the same texture. I could have maybe made two different textures here, but I think it worked out well in the end. For cylindrical shapes, such as the rope, you can cut a single seam up the edge, unwrap it, then use the to strip button to flatten out any wonkiness. This makes texturing it much easier. Be sure to always take into consideration how your object will look once textured. It's important to find a balance between saving UV space, using UV stacking, and making sure the stacked texture won't become obvious. Once I'm happy with my unwrap, I'm ready to start painting. I head on over to the paint room in 3D Coat. I set my lighting mode to unlit by pressing 2. This removes all lighting and lets me paint more accurately. First, I bake an occlusion and curvature map. For the occlusion, I set light sources to sphere and hemisphere. I want the various objects to cast shadows on one another, so I leave separate paint objects unticked. For my curvature map, however, I tick separate paint objects. I mostly do this as I found leaving it unticked gives me some pretty funky results. I set my curvature to overlay and my AO to multiply. They can be pretty overpowering though, so I usually crank the opacity on each down to about 50%. Underneath those two layers, I place my base color layer. You can do this step in 3D Coat or Photoshop, it's entirely preference. I like to use 3D Coat most of the time, as I can use the fill polygon paintbrush to block out areas that might not be part of their own UV island, such as this later face and the wooden planks of the central box. I'm just fast forwarding through here as I fill out the rest of my object with its base colour. I'll also apply a black to white gradient to my entire object using 3D Coat's gradient mode under the paint bucket tool. I set it to overlay and again crank the opacity down to about 50%. Before I move the texture over to Photoshop, I lower the padding so that the texture is more manageable. To do this, go to File, Export Objects and Textures, and then next to Create Padding, I change the value to about 16. I back out of that window as I'm not fully exporting right now. Now I hit Ctrl P to move all my layers over to Photoshop. I colorise my ambient occlusion and curvature maps by clicking here in the bottom right, then selecting Hue/Saturation. This will create a Hue/Saturation layer. I set one above both my AO and curvature layers. I set these as clipping layers so that they only affect the layer below. A quick way to do this is hold Alt and click the line between your two targeted layers. On each layer, tick Colorize and adjust the sliders appropriately. For my AO, I go for cool tones as it's my shadows, so a blue or sort of purple shade. I also reduce the saturation a little. I don't want it to be too overpowering. And for my curvature, I go for an orange to simulate the warm highlights of the candlelight. For the gradient map, I select the gradient map option instead of Hue/Saturation. To edit your map, click this channel, then adjust these sliders. The leftmost sliders represent the darker tones, which again, I'll make cooler shades of blue and purple, while the right represents the brighter tones, which I'll make warm oranges. Once I'm happy with all my maps, I flatten them down into a single layer. I use this layer mostly as reference while painting. You're going to end up painting over a lot of it, but it helps a lot throughout the painting process. I usually add another AO and gradient atop all my layers later in the process anyway, to help simulate light. With my base and all the bakes done, let's have a look at my final texture. You can see here on the tiled roof how I've used the base to assist me in painting. When I paint, I consider three major elements: details, highlights, and shading. Details are what I consider the lines and shapes that help define the surface of my texture. Examples of this are the cracks that separate my tiles or my bricks. Highlights is the lighting and reflections of my texture. You can see here the highlights I have painted on the edge of my tiles. Try to consider where your light is coming from. For me it's from the top, but if you don't have a clear light source, then top-down lighting is always a safe bet to go with. Lastly, shading is the surface colours. Things like shadows, dirt and colour variation. It's what helps reduce the flatness of your texture. I follow this process for the rest of my texture. There's no strict order in which I follow this process, I just jump back and forth, considering these elements as I paint. If I feel that a certain part of my texture is lacking, I just examine each of the elements to identify if there's any that could do with some improvement. I also like to add an artificial light layer. I do this by setting a layer to overlay and painting in areas that are heavily affected by my candlelight. Lastly, I reapply a gradient map. This helps to even out the lighting from top to bottom. With my model and textures complete, it's time to head on over to Sketchfab. For my settings, I went with lit shading. For hand-painted, I'll usually go with a shadeless look, but I like the slight shadows that were cast from lit. I didn't want it to be too overpowering though, so I lowered the light intensity way down to about 0.2. I like to add some ground shadows also, so I used the Baked AO Ground Catcher. It helps to ground your model and gives it a nice soft shadow. I used one small point light to help give a subtle glow to the lantern. You can see here the difference that it makes. It's subtle, but I think it helps. I apply all my materials, placing my Targa with its alpha channel into the opacity layer. I also added a slight opacity to my glass lantern, as well as some yellow emission to really help achieve that burning candle look. Lastly, let's have a look at my post-processing. I use SSAO to add some nice shadows to the crevices of the model. A very subtle depth of field effect. It's only really noticeable when you zoom in though. Sharpness is great. It helps to make the smaller details of your texture really stand out. I find somewhere between 0.1 and 0.4 works best. A slight vignette, and lastly, some bloom. I usually don't use bloom. It can be a bit hit or miss, and I feel it depends on the model, though I think it works really well here, helping to give the lantern that bright glow. Once I have something I like, I just export it out using Sketchfab screenshots. You can use the Sketchfab background or tick transparency and make your own background in Photoshop. It's really whatever you prefer. I just take these renders over to Photoshop, add the details, and I'm done. Here are the final renders. And that's it. I hope you enjoyed my breakdown. If there's any questions, be sure to leave them in the comments and I'll do my best to answer them. Big thanks to Stylized, CGMA and anyone who provided feedback throughout my project. If you want to see more of my work, be sure to check it out on my website, Artstation or Twitter.